Good afternoon. Welcome to Real Cost of User Data.
Caixin Media, and today our topic is the real cost of user data. Every day, human beings generated about 2.5 quintillion bytes of new data. That's 25 followed by 18 zeros. It's a phenomenally large number and is ever increasing. Users give away the personal data in exchange of free services, and those data has been collected, studied, analyzed in many ways by algorithms, which pick up behavioral trends, and then commodified and commercialized. Our economies are increasingly shifting to digital activities, but how do we harvest user data responsibly? Who should be held responsible, and who should we trust to hold this data? To me, these questions are not abstract. They're relevant to every one of us on the stage, in this room, to our children and next generation. And we're very fortunate to have 4 experts to help us answer those essential questions. Let me introduce them one by one. The gentleman on my left is Mr. Muhamad Fajrin Rasyid, the co-founder and president of Bukalapak.com, one of the largest e-commerce websites in Indonesia. And then followed by Mr. Xunlei, the CEO of Xunlei, for digital entertainment, cloud acceleration, cloud storage, and now very big in blockchain as well. And Dr. Joanna Bryson is associate professor of computing at the University of Bath, and Marsha, managing director of China, also the vice president at Booking.com. I think like every one of you, like many one of you in this room, I have a personal interest in this discussion as well, because I'm a user of 2 of the companies represented on the stage, and I'm curious about how my data has been harvested and used and also protected. So let me start first with probably with Xunlei. Lei, you had a very interesting and also very famous remark that data should be of the people, for the people, and by the people. Explain to us what that means.
I think that should be self-evident, shouldn't it? Maybe is it okay if I take a survey? How many of you in the audience believe that the data that internet companies collect and analyze about you should belong to the internet company?
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand. Nobody. Who in the audience believe the data should belong to you? Great. And there are some undecided voters, just like the American election. I think it's self-evident, and the issue has been hotly debated. Solutions have been proposed, but I think we've passed the framing of the problem phase. Really, what we're looking at today is how to really solve the problem. I think internet grew to today with massive user data and as the foundation. Big data and AI has become so powerful. It really presents very challenging problems to us. There are a couple of related problems. One is obviously the data privacy issue. Your data has been collected, managed, and analyzed, and used often not having the user's best interest in mind. Also, there's the user's right to knowledge of the internet is at stake today as well. Fake news become a big issue. It's influencing elections, Brexit, and it actually influencing our daily lives. So the currently proposed solutions, either for the social media companies to self-regulate or for government to step in and make tougher regulations, I think they're all necessary, but they're not sufficient, and perhaps not very efficient as well. What Xunlei is looking into the future we believe that code is rule. That's what people in the blockchain world believes. I think it is entirely possible to build the infrastructure of the internet, to build the rules about data protection and the rules about credibility of information into the very fabric of internet. What blockchain have told us is that you can devise and implement unbreakable rules over the otherwise chaotic internet. So that's one possible solution. Blockchain is a solution that can actually make financial transactions possible over the otherwise very chaotic internet. So there's no reason not for us to figure out a way to protect data and to also make sure that the knowledge, the information on the internet are credible. That's I think that's the phase we're at right now. And that's what Xunlei is working on.
Fascinating. And we'll come back to more on the blockchain as a solution to the problem. And next, let me ask Fajrin. You are one of the 8th largest, or as you told me, there are 8 unicorns in Southeast Asia, and you're one of them. And Indonesia is a massive market, a young market, and a fast-growing market. How do you deal with data? And do you face the same problems that Lei just laid out? And are you exploring similar solutions as well?
First of all, yes, Indonesia is a large market. We are the 4th biggest country in terms of the populations. And there's been saying that you cannot win Southeast Asia if you don't win Indonesia. Now, in a sense, it might be true, but since we talk about data, first we need to understand the context, right? Internet penetration seems to be big at over 60%. But if we talk about e-commerce penetration, the industry that Bukalapak is operating is right now only about 10% of the populations. Does it mean that e-commerce is not good yet? But if we look at the size of the e-commerce market in Indonesia, it's actually $15 billion market. And the growth is still 100% year on year, or almost double every year. So first of all, we need to understand the data in terms of the context. What does it mean for us and for our business, right? If we look closer, for example, the reason why internet penetration in Indonesia is high, but e-commerce penetration is not yet high, is because of the payments. So payment is still a challenge. So doing business in payment might be a good prospect. In fact, many companies are now entering a payment space. I agree that blockchain might be one of the cases, one of the solutions. We are looking at it now because I also agree that ultimately the user or the data ownership should belong to the user itself. Unfortunately, right now, the regulation and also the solution is still not yet there. The blockchain as it is now is things that need yet to be proven. Although as a concept, I really like that you can actually tokenize your identity with a token, and because you are the only one that have that private key to that token, everyone can know about you, and everyone knows that it is you, it is your data, and we can share the data partially to people who need it with my permission. There is this thing also called zero knowledge proof, where I can prove that what you want without actually giving you the data. I think one of the classic example is, let's say if I want to buy alcohol and then we need to present our ID, right, to the seller. But the seller only needs a proof that I am over 18 years old. Why do I need to tell them my birth date? With the blockchain, it seems possible. Although again, because of the scalability and others, it's still a concept. But at least from my perspective, this is something that us and also I believe some other big tech companies are looking, because we believe that ultimately we also want the best for our customers without the needs of breaking the privacy.
Thank you. And some of the themes are emerging that you also agree that data belongs to the user, and to some extent, regulation is to play catch up. And let me move to Martha. Booking is a Europe based company, but you're a global company. So how data and data analytics is changing the hospitality industry in general, globally?
Okay, so for Booking, just a little bit about Booking. Booking is actually the biggest OTA in the world. We use data to provide the most optimized customer experiences when people travel around the world. Imagine today when you come to Dalian to attend the conference, right? Because of your location and also because this person maybe used to always stay at 5-star hotels, we would, based on that information, recommend to you the location, the 5-star hotel that's within very short walking distance from this venue. So that's how we use data to actually provide the best customer experience. So in our mind, customers' trust is always our highest priority for the business when they choose to use Booking as a service. So in order to protect data and also protect customer privacy, first, we do a few things. First, we hold ourselves to the highest standard, which is GDPR. That's very widely used in Europe. And the second, because we're a global company, has more than 180 offices around the globe. And we actually apply, in addition to GDPR, we abide by all the rules from all the countries. So that's one. And second, because customer trust and customer value are our highest priorities, we keep investing in a dedicated team, technology, and innovations to keep upgrading our game in this area. That's second. And the third, because again, since we're a global company, work with all the different governments in the globe, we actually play a rather active role by working with different legislators and the regulators to help form a global framework about data privacy and protection. Because in this environment, given the nature of market dynamics, and the competition, without the rule of games, without a consistent framework of work, the nature of competition will drive everything to the bottom. So, and also, the last thing we do, not the least, is we actually hold transparency and disclosure to the consumers. We tell exactly the consumers what we're collecting, how we're using it, what are we using it for.
Thank you. And some of the points will come back, and thanks for a very comprehensive introduction. And then last but not least, let me come to Joanna. You are an expert on artificial intelligence and robot ethics. I'm very interested in robot ethics. Tell us some of the key questions we want to figure out before we make robots too powerful to control, especially behind the data analytics. Many of these are algorithms.
Right. Well, thanks for having me here. I think it's a really interesting question. How do we get in control of robots before they are in control of us? Because the robots that are human-like are never going to be in control of us, or very unlikely. The robots aren't the things that are in control. Rather, corporations control us through AI or militaries or other people possibly, right? So it's interesting that the question, even on a data panel, is about the robots, because we see a lot of science fiction and we think about robots as people, and we ignore the massive amount of AI that we're embedded in, that we're completely swimming in. We're all sitting here with our cell phones, identifying where we are and who we associate with. Arguably, there's actually some even more academic people than me, philosophers. Petit and List in 2011 suggested that corporations are already AI, that have taken over the world. I don't feel that way. I do think that it's a better perspective to think about the individual human obligations. And so the best way that we can make sure that someone doesn't take over the world with AI, or worse, just make a big mistake, say they were moving fast and breaking things, and then all of a sudden a democracy fell over, is to keep track. Remember that justice is about humans, and so humans are the ones that we can hold to account and that we should hold to account. And so keep track of how it is that we designed the system, who wrote it, how was it written, why was it written, what did they change, how did they test it, what data did they use, where did that data come from, how do they know that that data was secure, that there wasn't an injection by a hostile party. So cybersecurity of the whole system, including the logs of who wrote what, when. Always there's a person who's responsible for having built the system. That's what A in artificial intelligence stands for, artifact. So it's the way that we make sure that no one takes over the world with AI is by making sure that we make AI transparent and governable. And that doesn't mean it has to all be open source. It means that we have to work with governments and have regulatory bodies, just like medicine does. Medicine has 10 times the IP of ICT, and yet it's very well regulated. Well, it's pretty well regulated. So we could do the same thing. We can start working with government bodies to make sure that we have a fair, competitive area.
Thank you. And I agree with the idea that it's ultimately a human responsibility. So let's focus at this moment on the company, because we're talking about the cost of the user data, and I think there's a cost on the government side, on the company side, and also on the user side as well. Let's focus for now on the cost on the company. You, all three of you, come from companies, and you make data security part of your job, and that's a very important part of your mission. How costly is that? Especially you are from bigger companies, but for a smaller one, for a startup, that might harvest a lot of user data. But are they capable enough to protect the user data? Let's start from Fajrin.
So how much is the cost, is it? Cannot give you the exact numbers, but usually the cost is also directly correlated with the size of the company, meaning that the bigger your company, then obviously the cost associated with it will be bigger as well. Because one, the cost might be related with the user or transaction or number of whatever KPI the companies are looking for. So that is one element. The second element I want to highlight is that when we talk about the cost, it's not about technical cost, meaning building firewall or some protection servers in your platform, but also the cost of the educating the customers, because security overall is as good as its weakest link. And sometimes the weakest link is the user or the person. So majority of the attack of the data, in fact, is actually on this social part. We call it social engineering. So things like phishing, masquerading, and things like that are actually the most frequent attack in terms of the data. So yes, as a company, we need to improve the technical security aspect of our application, and it's something that we continuously improve. For example, even the companies like Facebook and Google, they do have what we call a bug bounty system, where they actually, instead of worry about hacker, they want to work together with hacker. They offer a hacker a chance to hack their system. If they are able to do so, then they will give the hacker reward. So those kind of things we also implement in Bukalapak. But the social thing is something that we need to really put attention on, because sometimes we don't really do that enough. Why? Because it seems something that is really, really obvious. But if you look at about it, maybe not in every country, but at least in some countries that I look for, is something that is still a problem. In offline world, for example, we do not enter a house just because the house looks the same with our house. We will double check the address, right? Is this my house address? Yes, then it's my house. But if we, in the online world, just because the website looks the same with our website doesn't mean it's the same website. Because sometimes we enter the website, meaning typing the username and password, without checking the address. So now it seems not so obvious, right? Because maybe some of us, I did that in the past as well, unconsciously. So things like that, some things that we potentially as a company needs to educate, but also maybe needs to put in the, because it falls into like a netizen or netiquette elements that seems obvious, but not so much obvious. So maybe also the government might think to put this in some way education in the primary or secondary elements.
government has a role to play in education and improving the literacy. Marsha, how would you deal with the cost and security?
I think it's hard to put a pricing tag on something so valuable like consumers' trust. Because I think having the consumers trusting by using our office and willing to share limited amount of data with us is priceless. I think instead of putting a price tag on this type of services or investments or technology, Booking is putting to address this issue or working with various government to move this forward. And this thing is definitely on top of the leadership executives' top of mind. And we know, as leaders of the companies, we know if it is on top of mind all the time, this is a huge investment for any of the companies. So, and also from Booking's perspective, because we're working with so many different government, so many different regulators, in addition to the GDPR. So it's actually really important for us. So having the EDPR, I think, is making a big movement forward. However, how we can make that piece of law even more understandable and implementable in our day-to-day environment, that's something Booking is working on with all the different regulators, legislators, to put that type of global framework. Because given the nature of technology, the globalization nature of technology, that is something we need.
That's actually something very relevant. I want to come back to Joanna about this, about the global, where there will be a consensus of more global legislation. But let me quickly check with Lei. How would you deal with the security issue? Because Xunlei actually has higher requirement. You are asking people to give you their extra bandwidth. They need to have a higher trust level on Xunlei.
So for people don't really know what Ms. Lee is talking about, we build our software mostly on user-owned devices, user-owned computing resources. We think centralized servers are sometimes the root of the problem, where data is, where a large amount of data is centralized in data centers. The payoff for any attacker to attack the system is very high. So the incentive for such attacks are higher. And it's also, internet security is, there's no absolutes in internet security. So today, the enemy is using artificial intelligence, is using big data. They have quite amount of data and using social engineering and so on to attack you. So we take a very different approach, which is that we actually don't have a whole lot of centralized servers. In 2017, I pledged Xunlei to become a serverless company, serverless internet company. So we distribute all the data on user-owned services, user-owned computing resources, and we provide reward to the users who share their computing resource to us. The data is scrambled and chunked, cut into very small pieces, and then stored in a variety of different devices. And the devices are trimmed in functionality so that it only serves as a cloud computing service, a very small granular cloud computing service for us. Because the device is trimmed to the bare minimum of functionality, so it becomes safer. There's not a whole lot of interfaces for attackers to attack. This approach works well for us, even though we still have a very large investment in data security, in consumer security, in information security as well. What I'd like to add to the question also is the social cost of data security. because in today's society, especially where mobile payment is used very widely, online scams, online crimes become rampant, become a bigger issue than even crimes on the street. And the cost of solving these crimes to catch the bad guys actually is higher than for crimes actually happening on the streets. There's no witness. Sometimes the crime is really about a very small, relatively small amount of money. The cost of solving each of these crimes actually probably cost more than the actual loss of the victim. And many times victims are hesitate to report those crimes, which in turn make the criminals more incentivized to do so. They can do such crimes in large scale by just making phone calls or pretend to be approaching you online, pretending to be your banker, your customer service, and so on. So the cost of addressing this issue become very high. I don't think there are standard statistics about it, but when we work with the police department, for example, public security department, at each level, they have told us this is something. This has become a bigger issue every year, and they do need help from the technological companies. I believe problems caused by technology is best solved with technology. So so that's why we're working towards a rule-based internet, where protections of the users are written into the code. If the code of the internet is the constitution of the online world, then what do we think we're missing? Just as the initial US Constitution is the Bills of Rights. The Bills of Rights of the internet users should be coded into the internet. And that's, I think, is something that fascinates me, and is something that we're investing in, and we're doing research in.
Fascinating. And the code of internet you mentioned is more from self-regulating, from the company themselves. And what about the role of the government? We have 3 representatives from the private sector, and Joanna is from academic, but I will beg you to put your shoes in the government. And what is the role in the government in this?
Right. Well, that's a really good question, and I think that a lot of the big tech, I haven't worked as well with the mid-sized tech. I'm learning from this panel too. Has hoped originally that they didn't need to worry about the government. In fact, when there's something really new, there basically aren't rules there. That's why people say the Wild West. It's when you move past where the government is used to looking, there can be no rules. But then there's several things that people have noticed that they might want the government after all. So for example, some of the disasters with cryptocurrencies have made people understand why banking over the centuries has come up with a bunch of rules. When companies realized, I mean, it seems from talking to people at Facebook that even though they were selling services to political parties, and they had people from the political parties, they were working with directly, they were still surprised that they had the power to change the outcome of an election. Somehow it didn't occur to them. But anyway, when it becomes obvious that really, it's not only, in fact, at Davos this past year, I heard an Israeli politician say, I don't need to know the outcome, if anyone can ever know whether or not the American election would have gone differently. But what bothers me most as a politician, was that I thought social media was the way I found out what people really wanted. And what I've found is that the people who voted for Trump after seeing Russian advertisements, and they knew they were Russian advertisements and very clearly tracked, they didn't care. Because now that they have the opinion, it's their opinion. And if the Russians gave them that opinion, then maybe the Russians aren't so bad because it's their opinion, right? And so for the Israeli politician, in a way, this is ironic because it means that politicians lead, right? It's not just that there's a bunch of ideas out there and you are just consolidating them. You have to lead. But anyway, for her, it was disturbing to know that that the people she was representing could become a completely different people because of some other third-party actor coming through the social media. And so I think that we need to recognize that government is not some alien force that was landed on us, but rather it's a mechanism by which we coordinate our activity. It is a means by which we produce public goods. Now, like any other kind of public good, you can worry that someone's gotten too big of a chunk and you need to worry about corruption and things like that. The same is true of companies, the same is true of individuals, might be thieves, But by and large, the reason we have this system is to solve the problems where we have mutual interests, and security is our mutual interest.
May I add to it? I do believe that government regulation is necessary given internet becomes so pervasive and so powerful. But also at the same time, I think government intervention sometimes can be heavy-handed. For example, Warren is talking about breaking up the top tech companies. That will have very severe consequences. Yeah. The important thing for me is that when we envisioned the internet, when we invented the internet, we've never imagined this is going to be this powerful and this pervasive. And so we were very focused on how to make it useful, how to make it powerful. But we didn't, from technical perspective, figure out what to do to regulate it.
Yeah. I think there's some really important ideas you had there. One of the things, so when you asked, the first way you asked the question, and then you went, and it came back, right? That first way was about, can we have one global regulation? And no, every country has different problems. They have different neighbors, they have different people, they have different resources. And so the trade-offs that they will make will always be a little bit different. But on the other hand, in some ways, we all have these common problems because we do have global markets. And because we have global markets, we have single companies who acquire huge amounts of wealth as well as influence. In the past, we thought maybe such systems were utilities. And so there's this big question about that. And but those utilities would then still happen inside of countries. So you could think of government, fundamentally what government is a machine that it recognizes a problem, it redistributes, it takes wealth from everybody and it redistributes, it allocates some of that money to solve the problem, and then it tries to get everybody to look another way so that that problem can have a time to settle itself. So those are the three things that government has to do. Who can do that across the whole world? We don't want to have one country that rules the whole world, so we have to find solutions. And interestingly, when you go to this problem of how do we do that, then these global companies actually may have a role in that too, because they have to, who watches the watchmaker, right? So we have to have a mutual way of maintaining the reduction of corruption on all levels. So I think we will, to go back to these big companies, I agree with you. It might make sense to split back up WhatsApp from Facebook because those were two different services and that may have been an abuse to merge those together. But fundamentally, if there's only going to be one search engine or one of a particular kind like LinkedIn or Booking.com, you have a lot of my data, and I feel very well repaid. I must say, I love your product, but I shouldn't say that probably, right?
Thank you.
I'm sorry I haven't used your guys' products. But you know, Booking.com is what you go to, right, to check, I don't know. So if you have relatively few companies that can be the best in their area, then of course you know, look at Boeing. Boeing is a similar company. Airplanes can go anywhere. The EU built another company at great expense, Airbus, so that we all have a choice of two companies, right? But they had to prop that up from the government. So, but we may also want to figure out something else, like negotiating, like the GDPR, with these companies to say, hey, if you're going to be doing service with all of our people, maybe you have to take a little different role than a normal company. Maybe you have to release a little bit more of the control than you used to have, and we need to have more transparency here.
But is it easy for the government to reach a consensus? Because many of the problems are global, and the data is cross-border, the revenue is cross-border, all the data assets and the business is cross-border.
Well, I think, yeah, there's a lot of problems here. I think the EU is a really interesting model because it is not a model where we've just built a bigger structure. So like in America, we have a bigger structure, and there's a tension between the states and the federal government about who has power. In the EU, there aren't any courts that are EU courts or an army that's an EU army, right? That, you know, in America, we famously had like the state militias against the federal government about the civil rights movement, right? You can't have that in the EU. It's just you set up a bunch of treaties between the countries, and then the countries all agree to implement them, and then they each individually implement the law. And I think that we could have a bunch of other hubs like that to negotiate, but then the regions come up with some way to do this. The Internet Governance Forum at the UN does seem to be pretty effective about having lots of different people and corporations sit on the same boards, regional representatives, countries. So the Internet Governance Forum might be the kind of model that would go forward.
And also the Fukuoka, the G20 finance minister and central governor discussion in Fukuoka just now also have more consensus emerging out of the digital taxation. But I want to move to Fajrin. Do you face similar discussions in Southeast Asia as well? Because in a fast developing market, you are facing the balance between growth or regulation. And how do you balance this two? And as a company, do you also, as Martha's company, pushing for more regulation so there's more unity? Better easier in terms of compliance?
Yeah, first of all, again, I think Southeast Asia right now is a very promising market. People say Southeast Asia is the next India and China. So when we talk about China experiencing a bit of slowdown, the Southeast Asia right now is actually experiencing the opposite. We're still actually at our natural growth, meaning that everything, as you mentioned, is just growing because the market itself is growing. So unless you do something really, really bad, your company is growing, will be growing. Now, in that sense, yes, our attention to the data and all the regulation is probably not as advanced as in the US, but I guess we keep closely on what happened in global market because some of the things that we also want to do, or at least want to start the thinking, is actually also going global, right? In fact, some of the players are already going regional. We actually started to expand to East Asia as well as of this year. So things that we need to check as well in terms of the regulation, not just in our home country, Indonesia, but also in other countries. And that includes this regulation of about data. Now, I think it's fair to say that it is a bit difficult to convene all the government, but I guess the government needs to at least see the data itself as an asset, things that is logical that asset can be regulated or must be regulated. So that's the first thing, because data itself has a value, and it is unique to each of the data that each of individual has. The second, the government can also start thinking to separate the data owner and the data itself. So I am different with what data says about me, right? I can post whatever pictures of me having a trip in Instagram, but it's not me, right? It's my picture or some part of me. And with that in mind, I, as a data owner, can opt to destroy the data as well. Although unlikely for me to destroy my house, but it is possible for me, if I want, for example, to destroy my data in some part of the ecosystem that I am interacting with, for example. So that kind of thing maybe can act as a fire starter when the government wants to talk about data, to see that the data is actually something that can be regulated if they treat it as an asset.
Are you doing that yourself?
I think right now we are also discussing with the government. Indonesia, we recently re-elected the president of Jokowi. What we like about the government of Indonesia is that they are really open to communicate, so not just blindly create new regulation, for example. So regarding the data itself is something that we keep providing inputs to the government from our view, and also try to ourselves to put the position of ourselves into the position of our users. For example, as a user, I might, the biggest thing that I worry is if I don't know what the data will be used for. For example, like the case of the US election is very, for me, I really fear if I somehow unconsciously choose some political thought because I see some ads or some whatever news happens in my social media. So we might also think about what is the usage of the data, right? I think in some countries or in some cities, some areas, when we want to buy or rent a house or a property, we need to state what's the property going to be used for, right? You cannot, for example, buy an office in a public housing area. So I might choose to give my data for some NGO that is working to cure cancer, for example. I might want to give my health data, but I don't want to give my data, at least not for free, for people who wants to develop a new drugs for whatever that they want to sell in a very high price. So that's, for example, as a user, that's some of the mindset that I try to, at least right now, have a train of thought of.
I see. And how about Martha? Are you doing similar things, or are you thinking about similar things, separating user data, the data itself, and the user profile?
Yeah, before I answer that question, I also wanted to make it clear about the booking stand, right? We're not pushing for more regulation from a global perspective. We just would like all the different government have the regulation about data more consistent and easier to understand and easier to implement. I personally just share a personal story with you guys. When I have to implement the GDPR and also ICBDP from GDPR from European government and the ICPCP from Chinese government together, I literally have 3 in-house lawyers and 2 outside consultants sitting in my office, have a discussion and understand exactly what does that mean, and how to balance the regulations and the customer trust and interest with the business performance. Yeah, and also customer experience. So that's why imagine a global company has to deal with all these different regulations. That's why we're pushing for something consistent. And also something I learned yesterday is a big chunk of the cost of implementing data protection around the world is the cost paid to the lawyers. Actually, it's kind of how ironic. You would wish for technology company, the biggest investment goes to development centers or the technology company, right? But it goes to the lawyers. So that's something I wanted
those
to.
Who cannot pay, who cannot afford those lawyers.
Yeah, and also I was thinking, in Booking's mind, when we talk about data, it's always 3 angles, right? First of all, is this common regulation that's important? And the second, the technology. I think that nobody gives better answer or more complete answer than Xunlei. So always give this complete, perfect answer, even back in our Tencent days together. But another thing I would like to see is the consumer's perspective, right? It's not to put blame on consumers of all this data privacy, even the election issues or things with the U.S. government. I think the consumers also need to put use some common sense in terms of what data we're sharing, how our data is used for. Is this an occasion is what I'm expected, right? This is how we can have consumers and also companies and the government all working together as a framework and to put something that can work for everybody, that can actually benefit the world and benefit the consumers.
How do you make informed consent or choices, Joanna?
Well, I'm just a little worried about you're getting consumers to think about what data we're sharing. The problem is that, I mean, if you look at what I knew before the 2016 elections, and Brexit and the US one were very similar, and the Brazilian one was worse, and this stuff is still going on. This is not the past, right? But anyway, was about that Microsoft had released some papers about the fact that they could predict voting behavior from the Kinect, this game thing that's sitting on the computer. Now, it's there so you can play games with it. You know that it's there to watch what you do. You don't think about the fact that you also have the television on, and there's advertising, there's election advertising, and it can see which ads you look at and which ads you turn away from. It can also see which members of your family you like more than the other members of the family. All this information is just there. And so this is why, the data protection and the cybersecurity are a huge issue. And if we're going to say people have to have these kinds of things in their home. Anyway, I thought that was going to be the problem. I knew the paper that actually turned out to be the problem, it was in a big journal, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It showed that if you had something like 50 or 60 Facebook likes, you could predict how somebody was going to vote better than their own partner, their spouse could, right? Now, and that was in fact what was used in this by Cambridge Analytica. It was people liking puppies and kittens. It wasn't that. In fact, in the UK, we had a law that you can't use data in a way that you weren't expected. In fact, it's an EU law, but we don't talk about that in the UK. but anyway, so all EU countries had such a law. Anyway, they gave Facebook the maximum fine they could under that law, which was £2 million. But they said, look, it's the maximum fine, and for other people who have larger fines, we encourage you to fine them more, and they're still hoping that America is going to fine Facebook a lot for this. But the reason was because this is just Facebook likes. Now, some people now are saying, okay, I don't have any social media, I don't want to be looked into, I don't want to be observed, maybe you don't even have any technology in your house. But we're getting so much data from other people that when you walk out of the house and we can see how you're dressed and how you stand, do you know they can tell whether I don't want to say how honest you are, whether or not you're telling the truth right now, partly from body posture. And we don't consciously know that, but we can do it with AI, right? So the fact is we need to figure out, I love the physical property metaphor. For sure, the police can get into my house, the army can get into my house, dedicated squirrels can get into my house, right? But if I come home and I find anything in my house that's not something that I've given the keys, then I have ways to take care of that. Usually, once in a while, a government is corrupt, something happens, but by and large, you can protect your house. That's, I think, what the GDPR is the beginning of, is this recognition that yes, we have this data, we can use it to predict what people are going to do, and then we can control those people. We can turn them in a direction, or maybe we can shut them up for having the wrong beliefs or talking to the wrong people, right? Those are the biggest scary things. Or the other scary thing is people who don't say what their beliefs are anymore because they're afraid of being locked up for them, right? So we worry about those kinds of silencing. But the point is you can try to defend yourself from those sorts of things, but we have to defend everybody. We're all in this together, because a country that has all their citizens afraid to say anything at all, it's not going to innovate, among other things. It's not going to have happy, healthy citizenry.
How to increase the awareness and protection of all. We still have 10 minutes left, and I want to open this to questions from the floor. We've discussed the responsibilities of the companies, of the government, and also the responsibility of the user of the cities themselves. So if you have questions, you can raise your hand, quickly identify yourself and who you want to answer this question. This lady over there, please.
My name is Bettina Hein. I'm part of the Young Global Leaders community, and I'm a serial tech entrepreneur. I was wondering to the panel, who of you is already working with the new open source framework that Tim Berners-Lee is championing, Solid? Do you have any collaboration there with your companies or academically?
Well, I'm friends with one of his former students, but no, I'm not working on that product.
I was looking at the Xunlei. If anything, it would be the front runner of any new technology.
Yeah, no,
not particular. In this case.
But it's related to what you were saying, right? So this is another effort to try to reinvent the basic core of the internet.
Right. So, well, the way that we approach it is this: there are a couple of reasons why when you have a much more distributed systems, data becomes safer. And so for us, for example, when we distribute all the data that across millions of devices, that we don't actually collect them, combine them, analyze them all together, we won't be able to look at each individual users and decide, okay, what this person is like. How can I trick this person to spend more on my platform? How can I trick this person to play my games longer or read gossips on my, social media longer? I think I agree with the comment that Joanna was making, that justice is in the people. But corporations do have a big burden of profitability, and data is one of the biggest assets they have. So to at one hand try to infer customers' needs from their behavior to better service customer, like what Marsha is doing in Booking.com, I think that's very beneficial to the society. But on the other hand, to target a particular user, to understand that particular person in a way that he himself doesn't understand that much, I think that's, in my mind, is evil. So we're building a AI training platform that distribute data onto millions of devices, and we don't actually look at the data. We can't collect the data and look at them holistically. We can't slice them individually to look at the data. But what we can still do is to use the data to train a model. We can then leverage the model to better service the customer without actually knowing the profile of each customer. So I think internet should be pushed down that lane. And I'd like to get back to the government regulation issue that Marsha and Joanna both talked about. I think it is a problem for companies, to multinational companies, to handle very different regulations that, especially through internet, especially when they operate through internet. So what I think the government role is a safety net. it should be a place where users that are being abused can address and get justice. But to proactively regulate, I think it's dangerous. It actually adds to the cost of data protection. And also, it is rarely that effective. This probably is a story that's not directly relevant, but my kids are in school, and in China, teachers take their phones away during school time. So what happens is that right across the street from the school, they're selling fake phones. The phone that looks exactly like the phone that you have in your pocket. So the students actually are handing those phones over to the teachers. So there is always ways to get around government regulation. And if you try to enforce it strictly, what happens is the legitimate business get distracted or bears very heavy burden. The good guys are always the sacrificial lamb of government regulation, in my mind. That doesn't mean that we don't need government regulation. It just means that it's not the best solution, or it's not the only solution. Mm-hmm. What really needs to happen is that we redefine the protocols of internet application. And we ask, or we help use technology to distribute data, to not to tell people who is collecting data and analyzing data using sometimes millions of servers, right? To crunch data about you. Personally, I'm very conscious when I use any keyboard application, right? Because every keystroke you put in, a keyboard application knows, right? It knows you intimately. And chat, right? Applications, and so on and so forth. So, but the world is evolving. You actually cannot live without them. In the beginning, I asked the audience to raise your hands if you think the data belongs to you. In reality, though, if you look at the user's agreement that you signed, more often than not, all your data, when you use the application, belongs to the company that wrote the application. To me, it's ridiculous, but that's the way the world is. So how does government regulate when legally the data belongs to those companies?
Joanna, I want to make a comment on the
Well,
box consensus.
Well, I want to say quickly about coming back to this, who owns the data. That there's certainly, when companies have done a lot of work to bring things together, to get you to think about it, to put the pieces in, you know, and Wikipedia you can't unedit. You know, you have contributed to the public good, and you know it, and that's over. And there's a permanent record, and you may grow up and wish that you didn't edit that page at 30 years in the past, but we're all going to have to deal with the fact that we had different interests 30 years ago than we do now, right? That's part of it. But I don't think that you can, even though I very much think it makes sense that the government defends your interests as one of its citizens and makes sure that you cannot be manipulated. At the same time, I don't think it entirely makes sense to say all that data is only belonging to you when it is these assets that have been put together at considerable expense. On the other hand, they couldn't have been put together without the citizens' involvement, and I think the tech companies should be natural allies of liberal world orders, because they want to see a well-educated citizenry that you know, has good nutrition, has freedom of movement. All of these things benefit the tech companies. So they should be signing up for reducing the level of inequality we have now that is creating some of these social fragmentations we see, which means they should be signing up for some kind of revenue. They're making a lot of money off of the data. It is their data, but they're making money so that it isn't that you give the money back. And a lot of what's happening now is actually bartering. We're bartering information. And when you barter, then there's no tax. And when there's no tax, then the infrastructure falls apart, and you get massive wealth inequality, and you get social chaos. It's very highly correlated. It has been for centuries. So what we need to see now is and some of the things people have been suggesting, are that you look at things like, forget about taxing income. At that point of barter, it's often speculation. People don't even know what that data was worth at that point. But rather, as you see a company's wealth increase, and you look at the market cap or something like that, then some proportion of that can be redistributed back to the nations in proportion to where the data came from. And that's the kind of thing people are looking at, that it shouldn't cost more, and it shouldn't change the order of the companies. It's not about writing one company's name into it and only taxing some companies and not other companies. It should be fair, but it should be fair in a way that creates a stable global structure and rules-based order.
A smart and more makes sense redistribution program based on the digital economy. We're running out of time. It's a fascinating discussion, but before we leave, I want you to take off the hats you are wearing as the company CEO or as the expert and give us some practical tips as the expert on digital economy, how to protect your own data. Just one sentence, so we can take away the practical tips and protect our own data better as a user. So start with Fajrin, please.
I guess as a user, we have to be mindful on what we share to the third party, be it social media, whatever, big tech companies, including applications that we download from the Play Store, which sometimes we don't really see what kind of permission that they want to ask from us. We just, accept and everything. Whereas the reality is it necessary for a photo editing app to get permission to access your location, for example? So that's something that...
And read all the things before you check out.
Yes.
And Xunlei.
Just be careful of what you use and what you buy. The 智能音箱, intelligent speakers, smart speakers.
Yeah, smart speaker.
I have 2 smart speakers. I never turn them on.
Why do you have them?
Because that's a bug in your home. You just bought a bug and put it in your home.
So be careful of their devices.
And you should add, never use a keyboard.
Never use keyboard.
He took mine. I was going to say, I really don't have more devices than I need. I don't have more apps than I need. I really try to limit things to reputable companies that I understand how they get money, and or people I know. I actually, one of the hard things is that it's hard for an ecosystem to defend itself. So recognize, when you're using Google, when you're using Apple, try not to mix things up too much. So I only run Facebook out of private Chrome browser window. I don't put the app on my phone. Things like that. I really try to reduce the tax space.
So basically limit your usage. And that, interestingly, that comment's coming from many of the CEOs here. So anyway, please join us in thanking our speakers today.
No, I already said, don't use a keyboard.
Don't use the keyboard.
Don't use a keyboard.
All right, please join me thanking our speakers today for the wonderful discussion. Thank you.